Hello, everyone. I'm Lori Spencer, and welcome back to JFK Jr., the man behind the myth. This is part 3 of this ongoing podcast series. As you probably know by now, John was my friend for 8 years, from 1991 until 1999, and I told the story about our friendship, how we met, and how that friendship evolved in episode 2 of the series. So if you haven't checked that one out yet, please do. And also be sure to check out the entire playlist. You can listen to every episode back to back. In episode 1, we explored the plane crash, the way he died. John, his wife Carolyn, sister-in-law Lauren Bissett, on July 16th, 1999. So if you're interested in the causes of the crash and how that happened, check out episode 1. But I didn't want to dwell too much in this series about how John died. I really want to talk about his life, how he lived, who he was. And that's why I called this series, the man behind the myth, because I really want you to get to know John the way that I knew him. And if you know that John Kennedy, then you have no choice but to love the guy, because he was a really, really wonderful human being. So in episode 3, the script that I wrote for this is just kind of sourced from several different books. I've read all the books about John, of course, and I've consulted those written by the people that were very close to John, his personal assistant for many years, Rosemarie Terenzio, his friend and history professor right here at the University of Oklahoma, Steve Gillen. That's my alma mater, by the way. His friends, Billy Noonan, Robert Lytell, and also the books that J. Randy Taraborelli has written. He's a prolific Kennedy chronicler. Currently in my book club on this here channel, I'm reading his book, The Kennedys After Camelot, and you might enjoy that one. I'll put a link down in the comments for you if you'd like to check that out. Also, the books by Richard Blow and Matt Berman, mostly about the years at George Magazine, and The Good Son by New York Times bestselling author Christopher Anderson, about John's childhood and his relationship with his mother, Jackie. And of course, you also know Christopher Anderson wrote the first book about John right after he died that came out in 2000, called The Day John Died. And that was a big source for episode 1. So what I wanted to do here, instead of doing this like a book club, I really just kind of went through these books and picked out anecdotal stories that, since I knew John, are the ones that I feel really capture his personality, the way he thought, who he was. And so I'm just going to kind of take you through his life in moments. And in this episode, we're going to rewind to the very beginning, even a little bit before he was born, and talk about John's childhood in the White House, the tragedy of Dallas, the early years, and his mother's remarriage to Onassis, and growing up as part of the Onassis family. It's going to be an interesting ride. So before we get started, please take a moment to hit the like button, share this video, share the playlist link with your friends who might be interested in JFK Jr. And of course, please subscribe to the channel, hit that notifications bell, and you'll always get a new episode when they drop. The date, November 24th, 1960. The place, aboard the Kennedy campaign plane, Caroline. The president-elect was in an upbeat mood, nursing a cocktail and talking about the makeup of his new administration, when word came from the cockpit that his pregnant wife had collapsed at their Georgetown home. He was devastated, stricken with remorse, his aide, Kenny O'Donnell, said, because he was not with his wife. John F. Kennedy had reason to feel guilty. Although Caroline's birth in 1957 had been a pretty easy one, Jackie had already endured a miscarriage and a stillbirth that nearly killed her. In the closing weeks of that 1960 presidential campaign, Jack had pressured Jackie to join him constantly on the campaign trail. She defied her doctors and reluctantly agreed, pushing herself to the edge. This final campaign surge ended with a ticker tape parade through New York's fabled Canyon of Heroes, a frenzied blur of mass hysteria during which the candidate and his wife perched precariously on the back of an open car. Several times they were both nearly yanked from the car by overzealous fans tugging at their sleeves. After taking such risks to ensure her husband's narrow victory margin, less than 0.1%, Jackie might have expected that Jack could make a little more time for her and for Caroline, the daughter he called Buttons. Instead, their red brick townhome on Georgetown's narrow N Street became Transition Central, overrun with both the hard-boiled rank-and-file members of Kennedy's Irish Murphia, as well as the youthful and energetic Ivy Leaguers who made up JFK's personal brain trust. The scene was no less chaotic outside, where reporters and onlookers pressed against police barricades across the street. Several times a day, Jack, still determined to accommodate the faithful whenever possible, strode across the street to shake hands and parry with the press. Jackie, sensing somehow that all was not right with her pregnancy, was now determined to obey her doctor's orders not to leave the house. Holed up upstairs, she begged Jack to spend time with her and Caroline. Instead, he began shuttling between Georgetown and Joe Kennedy's sprawling oceanfront estate in Palm Beach, Florida. There, JFK and his father, tended to by a household staff of 12, sunbathed in the nude while discussing possible cabinet appointments. Jack did agree to fly back to Georgetown to share a quiet Thanksgiving dinner with his wife and daughter, but only as long as he could fly back to Palm Beach that same night. Understandably apprehensive now that the due date was only 3 weeks away, Jackie again pleaded with him to stay. "Why can't you stay here until I have the baby?" she asked, "and then we can go down to Palm Beach together." Jack refused. Caroline had been born right on schedule, and Jack had no reason to think the next baby would be any different. Besides, 3 weeks might as well have been 6 months to him, their friend Bill Walton said. He was not about to put everything on hold just because Jackie was a little nervous. He had a country to run. As soon as he finished his pumpkin pie, Jack departed for Palm Beach, leaving a crestfallen Jackie behind. The president-elect's plane had only been in the air a matter of minutes when Caroline's nanny, Maud Shaw, heard Jackie's screams. Rushed by ambulance to Georgetown University Hospital, Jackie was immediately prepped for an emergency cesarean. Once he touched down in Florida, Jack commandeered the fastest aircraft available, the DC-6 press plane that trailed the Caroline, and headed straight back to Washington. En route, he put on the cockpit headphones and waited for some news. It wasn't until shortly before 1 a.m. on November 25th, 1960, that passengers and crew could finally breathe a sigh of relief when Press Secretary Pierre Salinger announced over the intercom that Mrs. Kennedy had just given birth by cesarean section to a healthy 6-pound, 3-ounce boy. The reporters cheered, and JFK, smiling broadly, took a bow. While the press was spoon-fed glowing reports that mother and child were doing well and resting comfortably, both Jackie and her baby remained in very guarded condition. Once the anesthesia wore off, Jackie, still in a lot of pain from her ordeal, demanded to see her son. She could see her baby, but was forbidden to hold him. The infant, suffering from what would turn out to be an undiagnosed respiratory ailment, spent the first 6 days of his life in an incubator. Jackie's condition, meanwhile, was also problematic. It would take months for Jackie and her baby to fully recover, but only after each suffered setbacks severe enough to take them to the brink of death. Chastened, Jack rushed to his wife's third-floor suite at the hospital and then popped into the nursery to visit his son. "Now that's the most beautiful boy I have ever seen," the president-elect gushed. "Maybe I'll name him Abraham Lincoln." To make up for the worry he had caused her, Jack visited Jackie and the baby 3 times a day. For now, a carnival atmosphere prevailed at the hospital. Buoyant and joyous were the words Life magazine's Gail Westcott used to describe it. It was innocent and it was exhilarating. It did not seem that anything could ever go wrong. Jackie spent almost the next 3 weeks in bed, trying to recover from her emergency C-section. Her baby, meanwhile, was losing weight, crying nonstop, and most disturbingly, at times, struggling for breath. John's health really wasn't doing so well, she later said. There was, thank God, this brilliant pediatrician in Palm Beach who really saved his life as he was going downhill fast. John was, in fact, suffering from an inflammation of the lungs' hyaline membrane, a condition not uncommon among premature infants. Sadly, this was the same respiratory problem that would later kill his infant brother, Patrick, in 1963. Jackie came perilously close to dying after John's birth, and so did the baby, said JFK's doctor, Janet Travell, who had added that the press corps was kept entirely in the dark. Jackie's own health suffered because she was consumed with worry over the baby. Jackie was very emotional about losing her son, Travell said. It was the thing she feared more than losing her own life. John was not even 3 weeks old, but he had already come close to death twice and was about to again. On the morning of December 11th, 1960, a would-be suicide bomber named Richard Pavlik was parked outside the Kennedys' Palm Beach mansion, waiting for the president-elect to head out for Sunday Mass at St. Edward's Church, just a few blocks away. Pavlik had planned to crash his 1950 Buick, packed with 7 sticks of dynamite, into the Kennedys' car as it pulled away from the house. Pavlik was about to floor his car when Jackie and Caroline suddenly appeared in the doorway to wave goodbye to Daddy. Behind them was the Kennedy family's private nurse, Luella Hennessy, holding baby John in her arms. Touched by this warm family tableau, Pavlik did not go through with his gruesome plan. It was only after he was arrested for drunk driving a few days later that Pavlik's weird assassination plot was uncovered. For his part, Pavlik was unrepentant. He told police he did not wish to harm Jackie or the Kennedy children, but that he still planned to get JFK. Pavlik was charged with attempted murder and sent to prison. Jack, who suffered from a variety of life-threatening illnesses and narrowly escaped death himself during World War II combat in the Pacific, barely blinked when he was told the news. His own experiences, coupled with the tragic early deaths of his brother Joe and his sister Kathleen, had convinced Jack that he would die young and that there was nothing he or anyone else could do about it. That's what his longtime friend, Senator George Smathers, said. Another Kennedy intimate, fashion designer Oleg Cassini, called this Jack's, quote, sublime streak of elegant fatalism. Jackie, on the other hand, was anything but stoic. She had blithely assumed that bodyguards and the Secret Service agents would provide them with all the protection they needed, and was outwardly very distraught when she was told how close she and her children had come to being blown to pieces. "We're nothing but sitting ducks in a shooting gallery," she said. "I always wish that I could have participated more in those first shining hours with Jack," Jackie would later say of those earliest days of his presidency. "But at least I thought I had given him our John, the son he had longed for so much." Those first few nights in the White House, Nanny Shaw was not getting much sleep. Jackie was upset that her infant cried constantly and didn't seem to be gaining any weight. John had been in such delicate health, Letitia Baldridge said, that naturally any little sign of something going wrong was cause for alarm. Shaw doubled the amount of formula the baby was getting and switched his morning meal of beef extract to lunchtime. Within 6 weeks, John was no longer crying incessantly. He had developed a healthy appetite for cereals, soup, strained fruit, vegetables, and meats. As an adult, John conceded that he could not actually distinguish between his first-hand recollections and what he learned from the newsreels, the photographs, and endless stream of Camelot tales spun by relatives and family friends. In the end, he believed that his earliest memories were playing with his father on the floor of the president's bedroom, part of the daily routine that seldom varied during their 1,000 days in the White House. He was absolutely crazy about Caroline. He adored her, their old friend Chuck Spaulding said. But there was a special connection with John. Even before John was able to walk, Jack would throw him in the air, toss him around, tickle him, things he did with Caroline, but to a greater extent with John. That he could do any of these things at all was remarkable in itself. In addition to his often incapacitating allergies and a medical history that included scarlet fever, anemia, an underactive thyroid, colitis, and a cholesterol level of 350, Jack had long been secretly battling Addison's disease, a degeneration of the adrenal glands that, somewhat like AIDS, destroys the immune system. He also endured crippling back pain so severe that he spent most of his time hobbling around on crutches. As a result, the president risked a visit to the emergency room every time he roughhoused with his kids. You'd see that look on his face that told you the pain was just terrible, White House photographer Jacques Lowe said. But he never complained. To see the sheer joy on his face when he was playing with John, obviously to him, it was all worth it. At the White House, JFK would get a few minutes of free time and summon John in much the same way as he did his daughter, calling the boy's name repeatedly because John didn't answer the first time, "John, John," while he clapped his hands. It usually took several tries before the easily distracted toddler actually showed up, prompting staffers around the White House to start calling the president's son John John. It was a nickname neither parent embraced. Jackie hated the whole John John thing and would cast a withering glance in the direction of anyone who used it, Letitia Baldridge later said. To her and to the president, he was always just John. John's earliest childhood memories also included Caroline's cat, Tom Kitten, who eventually had to be given away because of their father's allergies to cats, a beer-drinking rabbit named Zsa Zsa, after the actress Zsa Zsa Gabor, a friend of Jack, and a rotating cast of lambs, ducks, and guinea pigs. Aside from the dogs, the Kennedy children spent most of their time playing with the animals allowed to be kept in cages up in Caroline's room. Bluebell and Marybelle, the hamsters, and Caroline's favorite pet, a canary she insisted on naming Robin. JFK delighted in tickling his son, leaning down at staff meetings so that the kid could babble in his ear, or tossing him into the air, regardless of the often painful consequences. John famously hid under his father's desk while the president teased, "Is there a rabbit in there?" Sorry, I do a bad Boston accent. But the game that father and son played the most frequently was called Going Through the Tunnel, which simply involved scampering between the president's legs and back again. And at some point, JFK would gently spank John's behind or playfully grab him as he tried to make it through his legs. All the while, the president took a lot of obvious delight in simply touching the boy, a connection that Jackie and others called sensual in nature. He would nuzzle John the way that a bear nuzzles its cub, Letitia Baldridge observed, pausing for a moment to inhale and smell his hair and his skin. It was really very moving because President Kennedy was very reserved otherwise. You never saw him hugging or kissing anyone in public, not even his wife. The children gave JFK a chance to behave just like any other loving, affectionate American dad. It began with Caroline, but it was really John who opened up the president's heart. For the time being, aviation, not politics, was foremost on the mind of young John Kennedy Jr. At 13 months, he took his first public steps at the Palm Beach airport, seeing his father off to Washington. Less than a month later, John was scampering up and down the center aisle of Air Force One, playing peekaboo with members of the White House press corps. Soon, the newsreels and photos captured John jumping up and down with anticipation as his father's helicopter set down on the south lawn of the White House. Nothing got him more excited than that helicopter, Press Secretary Pierre Salinger would say later. President Kennedy would get off and lean down to scoop John up, and the boy would run right past him with his toy helicopter in his hand. As much as he missed his father, John really wanted a ride in that chopper, which he called the helichopper because he couldn't say helicopter yet. When a real helicopter wasn't around, John simply became a helicopter, spinning around in circles with his arms outstretched until he collapsed on the ground. The president thought this was hysterical, Chuck Spaulding later said. He even came up with a new nickname for John. He started calling him Helicopter Head. He was absolutely determined to spoil John from the beginning, Senator George Smathers said. He could not deny that boy anything. If the president was talking to a cabinet member or maybe some head of state, it didn't matter. He'd stop everything if John came skipping into the Oval Office. If JFK had one concern about his son, it was that young John was being seduced by the trappings of war, the marching bands, the wreath layings at the tomb of the unknown soldier, not to mention the 21-gun salutes and flyovers that often greeted visiting dignitaries. John was right there, the president said, whenever guns, swords, or anyone wearing a uniform were involved. It was actually the First Lady who actively encouraged John's interest in the military pageantry, making sure he had an unobstructed view whenever a marching band or honor guard were on the premises. John loved it because she loved it, Letitia Baldridge said. And don't all little boys love that sort of thing anyway? In early March 1963, Jackie confided to UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, the two-time Democratic presidential nominee, that she was pregnant again, and she was sure in her mind that it was going to be a boy. The son they already had was proving himself to be quite a handful. Celebrating the Easter holidays in Palm Beach, Jackie and Maud Shaw exhausted themselves trying to corral John as he scampered across the neighbor's lawn in search of colored eggs. He later threw a full-fledged tantrum at a White House reception for Luxembourg's Grand Duchess Charlotte. And he nearly clobbered the Yugoslavian president, Marshal Tito, when he accidentally dropped his toy gun from the Truman balcony while Tito and JFK stood below. On the morning of August 7th, 1963, halfway through her 7th month of pregnancy, Jackie took Caroline to her riding lesson at a local stable when she suddenly began to experience labor pains. Within 20 minutes, a helicopter was carrying her to the hospital at nearby Otis Air Force Base. "Please hurry," she begged Dr. Walsh. "This baby mustn't be born dead." At 12:52 p.m., Jackie gave birth by cesarean section to the boy she had prayed for. Weighing just 4 pounds and 10 ounces, the baby was immediately placed in an incubator. In 1963, few babies of this size would survive. To further complicate matters, he suffered from the same lung disorder, the hyaline membrane disease, that afflicted their stillborn daughter, Arabella, and had nearly killed John as a baby. The base chaplain was summoned immediately to baptize the boy, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, after Jack's paternal grandfather and Black Jack Bouvier. Patrick was 40 minutes old when his father arrived from Washington. Although the press was being told only that Jackie and the baby were in good condition, the decision was quickly made to transport Patrick by ambulance to Children's Hospital in Boston. Jack spent some time with his wife, whose post-operative condition was very serious enough to require multiple blood transfusions, then joined John and Caroline at Squaw Island to reassure them that everything was going to be fine. But it wasn't. Soon the nation was holding its collective breath and praying for the child's recovery. By the next day, Patrick's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was moved to a hyperbaric chamber in the adjacent Harvard School of Public Health. Using a suite at Boston's Ritz-Carlton Hotel as his base, JFK visited his son 4 times, then helicoptered to Otis Air Force Base to check in on Jackie. While reporters swarmed outside, the president decided to spend the night at the Boston hospital where Patrick was undergoing treatment. Jack was holding his son when the baby died at 4:04 a.m. on Friday, August 9th. He put up quite a fight, the president told his closest aide, Dave Powers. He was a beautiful baby. The president rushed to his wife's side. Once at Otis Air Force Hospital, he strode purposely past the rows of red-eyed medical personnel toward the First Lady's room. "Oh, Jack. Oh, Jack," Jackie sobbed as they broke down in each other's arms. "There's only one thing I could not bear now, if I ever lost you." The date, November 22nd, 1963. The place, Washington, D.C. Someone would have to tell them, but not Jackie. She couldn't bear the thought of facing John and Caroline and trying to explain that they would never see their father again. It had been only a few hours since she held her husband's brains in her hand. Now she had so much to deal with: the funeral, leaving the White House, finding a way to go on without him, and it seemed only fair that someone else should shoulder this particular burden. It had to be someone who wouldn't collapse from the strain of performing it, as Jackie feared she would. "I think Mrs. Shaw should do exactly what she feels she should do," Jackie told her mother, Janet Auchincloss. "Miss Shaw will have to judge how much the children have seen or heard, or whether they are wondering. She will just have to use her own judgment." From the moment she heard that shots had rung out in Dallas, Maud Shaw feared that Jackie would ask her to break the news to the children. Less than 4 months earlier, the no-nonsense, resolutely dependable Miss Shaw had broken the news of Patrick's death to John and Caroline. But this, she was close, perhaps too close, to the children. It would break Miss Shaw's heart to tell them that their father had been killed by an assassin's bullet, every bit as much as it would break their mother's heart. Family and friends had been gathering at the White House, and Shaw approached them all, as well as members of the Secret Service kitty detail, pleading for someone else, anyone else, to volunteer. "I haven't the heart to tell them," she said. "Why can't someone else do this? I can't. Ben Bradley had almost taken care of the job for her. Before leaving the White House to join Jackie at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, where the president's autopsy was being conducted, Jack's journalist friend declared, "I'm going to tell them myself," before his wife, Toni, pulled him back. Instead, he wound up doing his best to entertain and distract the children. "Tell me a story," John demanded. "Tell me a story." Bradley did, again and again, and it was obvious he'd have to come up with something else. "Chase me around the house," John demanded. Bradley did, and John happily obliged, squealing with delight as he chased Ben Bradley down the hall into the west sitting room, through the family dining room, and into the yellow oval room. Miss Shaw only felt worse as she watched John play. A oblivious to the monumental events that were swirling around him. High-ranking government officials were arriving throughout the night, some by helicopter, and every time a chopper touched down on the lawn, John would stop whatever he was doing and screamed, "Daddy's home! Daddy's home!" Maud Shaw put John to bed without saying anything. He was too young to understand, she reasoned, and there was certainly no harm in waiting until the morning. The nanny decided that Caroline required an entirely different approach. It's better for children Caroline's age to get a sadness and shock before they go to sleep at night, Shaw later explained to Jackie. That way it won't hit them so hard when they wake up in the morning. Shaw waited until Caroline had changed into her pink pajamas and brushed her teeth before tucking her in. The nanny sat on the edge of the bed, and Caroline snuggled up with her favorite pink teddy bear. As Shaw took Caroline's hand in hers, the little girl could see her eyes welling up with tears. "What's wrong, Miss Shaw?" she asked. "Why are you crying?" "I can't help crying, Caroline, because I have some very sad news to tell you," Shaw said. "Your father has been shot. They took him to a hospital, but they couldn't make him better. He's gone to look after Patrick. Patrick was so lonely in heaven. He didn't know anyone there. Now he has the best friend anyone could ever have, and your father will be so very glad to see Patrick." Caroline instantly burst into tears. "But what will Daddy do in heaven?" she wanted to know. "I am sure God is giving him enough things to do, because he was always such a busy man," Shaw tried to explain. "God has made your daddy a guardian angel for you and for Mommy and for John." Shaw remained with Caroline for more than an hour, stroking her hair gently as the little girl buried her head in her pillow and sobbed herself to sleep. There would be no sleep for the nanny. Her heartbreaking assignment was only half done. At 8:30 the following morning, Nanny Shaw went into John's room and gently woke him. "John, your father has gone to heaven to take care of Patrick," she said. "Did Daddy take his big plane with him?" the boy asked. "Yes," she answered. "I wonder," John said, "when he's coming back." That night, Jackie opened notes that the new president had written to each of the children just hours after their father was killed. Quote, "It will be many years before you understand fully what a great man your father was," President Lyndon Johnson wrote to John Kennedy Jr. "His loss is a deep personal tragedy for all of us, but I wanted you to know, particularly, that I share your grief. You can always be proud of him." Jackie read the notes from the president aloud to John and Caroline. Then she asked Maud Shaw to bring pencils and paper for the children. "You must write a letter to Daddy now," she told Caroline, "and tell him how much you love him." Caroline covered the page with large block print in all caps. "Dear Daddy," her letter read, "we are all going to miss you. Daddy, I love you very much. Caroline." Jackie then told her son to add something of his own, and John, who was not yet 3, scribbled a large X on the page. Jackie stayed up until dawn, writing her own rambling 5-page letter to Jack. It was drenched in tears by the time she was finished. Jackie was physically and emotionally drained. Fearing that she would crumble under the strain of what lay ahead, she turned once again to Dr. Max Jacobson. She was changing into her black mourning dress when Dr. Feelgood, as he was called, was ushered into the White House, as usual through a side entrance. Once upstairs, he greeted Jackie warmly and was soon digging through his battered black medical bag for vials and syringes. The President and the First Lady had long relied on Jacobson's injections, amphetamines, mostly dexedrine, mixed with steroids for the energy boost that they needed to make it through their frantically busy day. Dr. Max's potent cocktails were perfectly legal at the time, although Dr. Travell and the rest of the White House medical team urged caution. The official position of the Food and Drug Administration at that time was that amphetamines and steroids were neither harmful nor habit-forming. No one disputed that without a little pharmaceutical assistance from Dr. Max, Jackie would have completely fallen apart. Over the next few days, Jacobson remained in the shadows but was always close at hand. "I was always there when she needed me," he later said, "and she needed me quite a lot." Soon, the president's body would be moved to the Capitol Rotunda, where more than 250,000 mourners would stand in line for hours to pay their last respects. Jackie and Jack's brother Bobby, described by Bradley as catatonic with grief, walked down to the East Room to see JFK one last time. The lid of the coffin was gently opened, and Jackie placed the 2 letters, the children's and the one Jackie had written, inside, along with a pair of gold cufflinks and a favorite piece of scrimshaw, a whale's tooth carved with the presidential seal. Bobby put in a clip of his own hair, a silver rosary, and the gold PT-109 clip that Jack had given him. Jackie had offered words of comfort to Jack's devoted personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, and now dropped into Pierre Salinger's office looking, in Salinger's words, almost ghostly. As she began to speak, JFK's longtime press secretary and friend struggled to contain his own emotions. "Pierre," she said, "I have nothing else to do in life but help my children deal with this terrible problem, the effect of their father's assassination, to bring them up well and see that they become decent, caring, and intelligent people. I have to make sure they survive." As Jackie spoke, in Dallas, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby lunged from the shadows and shot the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Another shocking scene broadcast live into millions of homes across America. Although conspiracy theorists would speculate for decades on Jack Ruby's true motives, he claimed he shot Oswald to both spare Jackie the ordeal of a trial and avenge her children. She had planned for John to join her and Caroline in the Capitol Rotunda, but things didn't quite work out that way. John had managed to follow his father's casket up the Capitol's 35 steps alongside Caroline and his mother, but once at the top, he began to squirm. Maud Shaw instantly whisked him off to an office down the hall. He was instantly drawn to a bulletin board covered with dozens of tiny American flags. "Would you like one?" asked a congressional aide. "Yes, please," John responded. "And one for my sister, please." The man plucked 2 flags off the bulletin board and bent down to hand them to the toddler. John turned to leave, but then realized he'd forgotten something. "Oh," he said, "and may I have one for my daddy?" Startled, the aide handed him a 3rd flag, and John scampered off to proudly present it to his mother. That night, it was only as she began walking the children to their bedrooms that it occurred to Maud Shaw that Monday, November 25th, was more than just the day of JFK's funeral. It was also John's 3rd birthday. As in previous years, it was understood that the children would have a joint birthday party halfway between John's and Caroline's. This year, she was turning 6 on November 27th. But what, the nanny pondered, was the right thing to do on John's actual birthday, the day his father was to be laid to rest before a television audience of millions? Over breakfast the next morning, Miss Shaw and Caroline sang happy birthday to John over breakfast. Then he unwrapped 2 gifts, yet another toy helicopter from Caroline and a book about planes from his nanny. Barely an hour after he opened his presents, John was sitting alongside his sister in a limousine bound for St. Matthew's Cathedral. They were to wait for their mother to join them there. In the meantime, to the eerie, unforgettable cadence of muffled drums, Jackie, flanked by Bobby, Teddy, and the rest of the family, walked behind the horse-drawn caisson, bearing the president's body from the White House to St. Matthews. The same caisson that had carried Franklin Roosevelt's coffin was pulled by 3 pairs of perfectly matched gray horses, and following close behind was the traditional riderless horse, named coincidentally Blackjack. As he squirmed in his seat at the cathedral, it seemed clear that John Kennedy Jr. was going to be a handful today. Jackie asked Bob Foster, a member of the Secret Service kiddie detail, to take her son off to a small room at the rear of the cathedral. Among the many officers standing near the door to the room was an Army colonel with a chest full of medals. He knelt down and, by way of entertaining the bored little boy, patiently explained what each medallion, cross, star, battle ribbon, and leaf cluster meant. After a few minutes, Agent Foster whispered that it was time to go back inside the church. John turned to salute the colonel, but with his left hand. "Oh, no, John," the colonel said. "That's not the right way to salute. You salute with your right hand." After a few practice tries, the officer was satisfied that John had gotten the hang of it. As everyone gathered outside the cathedral to watch the flag-draped coffin leave for his final journey to Arlington National Cemetery, John took his place at his mother's side. Jackie's tear-stained face, only partially concealed behind a fluttering veil of black lace, leaned down to her son and said quietly, "John, you can salute Daddy now and say goodbye to him." John snapped to attention, lifted up his right hand, and snapped off the salute that came to symbolize a nation's grief. It may have been the moment that secured John's place in the hearts of his countrymen forever, but once again he would find it difficult to separate his own memories from what he had seen and read over the years. "I've seen that photograph so many times, and I'd like to say I remember that moment," he mused 30 years later, "but I don't." That afternoon, there was a small birthday party for John in the family dining room. Jackie had decided that while they would still have a joint celebration for the children later in the week, her son deserved to be happy on his special day. "John knows today is his birthday," she said, "and I did not want to disappoint him. Besides," she added, "we need a party on this day more than any other, don't you think?" After blowing out the 3 candles on his cake, with a little help from Caroline, John wasted no time tearing through the wrapping paper on his gifts. But not everyone was in a festive mood, obviously. Emotions were, in fact, strained to the very limit. When Dave Powers burst into the song "Heart of My Heart," which was always a favorite tune of Jack's, Uncle Bobby again began weeping and darted from the room. There was one more sorrowful duty for JFK's young widow to perform that night. She had wanted her stillborn daughter, Arabella, and their son Patrick, reburied next to their father. So, in a top-secret mission directed by Bobby, the children's bodies were disinterred and flown into Arlington aboard the Caroline. Late that night, Jamie Auchincloss joined Bobby, Teddy, and Jackie at JFK's gravesite for a brief, secret burial, the second in only a matter of hours. It was incredibly touching, but Jackie had that look of resolve, said Auchincloss, who remembered that the ceremony took place in almost total darkness, with JFK's eerie, flickering, eternal flame as the sole source of light. Jackie wanted to bring them all together again, and she did. Jackie and the children then flew to Hyannisport to spend Thanksgiving with the rest of the Kennedy clan. While John and Caroline played with their unruly cousins, their mother spent an hour upstairs, consoling the wheelchair-bound father-in-law behind closed doors. The mere presence of Jack's wife and children unleashed a torrent of emotion among the staff. "Tears everywhere," said Secret Service agent Ham Brown. Secretaries, nurses, Secret Service, we were all a mess. Mirroring the scenes played out in millions of homes that Thanksgiving, John and Caroline sat at the children's table, while Bobby's undisciplined tribe of kids made rude faces and threw food at each other. Even at the age of 3, John was a complete gentleman compared to that bunch, Jackie's friend George Plimpton said. He and Caroline were spirited, but they weren't spoiled brats. They knew how to behave because their mother drilled it into them. The day before the big move out of the White House, John spotted a cardboard box marked John's Toys, N Street, and began to cry, convinced that his toys were leaving without him. After assuring John that he and his toys would soon be reunited, Maud Shaw suggested he put on his new Marine uniform and then pick out a few select items that they could hand carry to their new house in Georgetown. John sat on the floor and dipped into the packing carton to retrieve some toy swords, a cowboy gun, and, of course, a helicopter. On December 6th, the White House staff lined up to say goodbye to Jackie and the children. It was very sad, of course, J.B. West said. Everyone was very, very emotional, but Mrs. Kennedy could not have been more gracious. Secret Service agent Bob Foster decided to distract John from this ceremony by taking his hand and leading him on a quick stroll around the grounds. It wasn't long before John declared he was thirsty, and as Foster lifted him up to drink from a water fountain, a White House photographer suddenly appeared. John stopped and glared at the man. "What are you taking my picture for?" the boy asked. "My daddy's dead." The photographer and Foster both broke down in tears. That afternoon, John and Caroline managed to duck out for some playtime at a local park. While they bobbed up and down on teeter-totters, 2 Secret Service agents stood guard. The law in 1963 stipulated that Jackie and her children were entitled to government protection for only 2 more years. That period was later extended to cover the children of ex-presidents until age 16 and a presidential widow until remarriage or death. Unfortunately, it quickly became evident that the Secret Service was virtually powerless to shield JFK's young family from the prying eyes of an insatiable public. Gawkers pressed up against police barricades on both sides of the street just outside the Harriman House in Georgetown, and traffic was at a standstill as drivers and their passengers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the world's most famous family. The late president's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, and John had developed a strong bond during the White House years, based in part on the fact that she often doled out some candy to him whenever he happened to drop by the Oval Office to visit his dad. Transferred to a small office in the Executive Office Building, Evelyn Lincoln now faced the monumental task of organizing her late boss's belongings and papers. John asked if he could call Miss Lincoln one day to let her know they would soon be paying her a visit. Nanny Shaw held the phone up to John's ear. "Hello, Mrs. Lincoln," John said. "This is John." "Why, John," she answered. "What a wonderful surprise." "I'm going to visit you with Mrs. Shaw soon." "That would be lovely, John," Lincoln said. "I'm looking forward to seeing you." "Me too," he said. Lincoln waited for John to go on, but there was only silence on the line. The boy, she concluded, was obviously thinking. "Mrs. Lincoln?" he asked tentatively. "Yes, John?" This time there was an even longer pause. "Is Daddy there?" "Let's face it," Chuck Spaulding said. Bobby was in every way the logical choice to be a surrogate father to those kids. For both John and Caroline, it must have been very comfortable having him around, reminding them of their father, Spaulding continued. The way he sounded, the way he talked, the body language, the hair, the teeth. Over the next 6 months, Jackie took her children over to Hickory Hill almost every day to play with Bobby and Ethel's brood of 8. "They think of Hickory Hill as their own home," Jackie said. If there were any Father's Day activities at school, Bobby showed up for Caroline. She, in turn, showed her report cards to RFK. Her artwork during this period was invariably marked to Uncle Bobby and brought to him for his approval. RFK was equally hands-on in his treatment of his nephew, picking John up early each morning, driving him to his Justice Department office, where he played with his cousins, Michael and Carrie. To recreate the child-friendly atmosphere that had prevailed in the Oval Office, Bobby periodically stopped conferences and staff meetings so that he could play leapfrog or hide-and-seek, or simply toss a squealing John into the air. In truth, there was really only one person that Jackie trusted to protect her family, the same man her husband had leaned on heavily, both in the Senate and throughout his presidency. It was a decision that, in a sense, had been made long before Jack's death. Jackie and JFK had stipulated in their wills that if anything ever happened to both of them, John and Caroline would be raised by Bobby and Ethel. Now, I want them, meaning Caroline and John, to be part of that family, Jackie said. Bobby wants to look after his brother's children. There's John with his brother's name. He's going to make sure John turns out as he should. It was not long before Jackie, convinced that only Bobby could replace Jack in her children's lives, asked RFK to legally adopt them, a move that would have given Jackie and Bobby equal status as guardians. Ethel, who had never been particularly fond of her idolized sister-in-law, vetoed that plan. Adoption notwithstanding, John was soon learning what it meant to be a Kennedy, the hard way. At Hickory Hill, RFK spent the better part of one afternoon trying to teach his nephew how to kick a football. John's approach was to kick at the ball, watch it roll a few feet in front of him, and then fall on the ground. "Get up, try again," Bobby told the boy. John did, kicking at the ball until it rolled away from him and then collapsed again. This went on 3-4 more times before John finally fell to the ground and stayed there. "Come on," an exasperated Uncle Bobby said. "A Kennedy never gives up." Refusing to budge, John looked up and said, "Humph, here's one that does." Jackie seized every opportunity to get out of Washington. Not wanting to abandon the family's tradition of spending Easter with the rest of the Kennedy clan, she and the children flew to Palm Beach. This time, Jackie hosted an Easter egg hunt for 40 local children that included special prizes supplied by FAO Schwartz, the famous Fifth Avenue toy store. Things seemed to be going smoothly until John and a 4-year-old named Richard began fighting over what was then one of the hottest toys for boys, a G.I. Joe action figure. Jackie jumped into the middle of the fray and managed to pull the battling tots apart, but not before a wrought iron end table was overturned. Mortified, Jackie handed the G.I. Joe in question to the other little boy and eventually fetched another one for her son, but not before carrying John inside, bending him over her knee and spanking him. The sound of the little boy's wailing brought an abrupt end to the merriment outside. "My mother was very strict with me," John later said. "Caroline could do just about anything, but if I stepped out of line, I got a swat." In truth, Jackie knew that John would inevitably be more closely linked with JFK's legacy in the public mind. Jackie hated bratty behavior, really hated it, and in the Kennedy family, you didn't have to look far to see kids who were just spoiled rotten. Her friend, Cleveland Amory, said, "Jackie spent more time disciplining her son for the simple reason that," he observed, "Caroline was always so well behaved, so eager to please. John, in a word, wasn't. As a small child, John was what you'd call a handful." Jackie went apartment hunting in New York in June of 1964. To throw off the press, her best friend and assistant, Nancy Tuckerman, played the role of prospective buyer, while Jackie went along disguised as the Tuckerman family's nanny. Jackie made several apartment hunting trips to Manhattan before paying $200,000 for a 5-bedroom, 5-bath, 15th floor apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue. The co-op was owned by Mrs. Lowell Weicker, whose husband would later serve as Connecticut's Republican senator and later as the state's governor. It was steps from one of Jackie's favorite haunts, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and boasted sweeping views of Central Park and the reservoir. By making a complete break from her life in Washington, Jackie sold the weekend house in Wexford for $130,000 and replaced it with a rental not far from Bobby's summer home in Glen Cove, Long Island. Angered by LBJ's decision not to pick him as his 1964 presidential running mate, Johnson instead chose Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. Bobby was now planning to become a permanent resident of New York and run for the U.S. Senate. John was with his sister and mother in Georgetown when tragedy struck for the family yet again. On June 19, 1964, Bobby called Jackie to tell her that his brother Teddy had insisted on flying through a storm to Springfield, Massachusetts, to accept his party's nomination for a second term in the U.S. Senate. Ted's small plane crashed, killing the pilot and Ted's aide and breaking the senator's back. "Somebody up there doesn't like us," Bobby said. That November, Bobby clobbered his opponent at the polls, racking up a 700,000 vote margin of victory. Ironically, Jackie was not among them. She refused to cast her vote for anyone in the 1964 election, not even for Bobby, and certainly not for LBJ. "This is very emotional, but I'd never voted until I was married to Jack," she later explained. "The 1964 vote would have been his. He would have been alive for that vote. And I thought, I'm not going to vote for anyone because this vote should have been his." Jackie understood full well how Lyndon would react. I know she conceded that LBJ was hurt, but not Bobby, who publicly acknowledged that he too refused to cast a vote for the Texan who had replaced his brother in the White House. Beyond mastering the art of hiding in plain sight, Secret Service agents were ordered by Jackie point blank not to spoil John and Caroline. "It's bad for the children to see grown men waiting on them," Jackie said. "I want you to tell Caroline to pick up her clothes, shoes, toys, and so on. The same goes for John." Mrs. Kennedy is adamant in her contention that agents must not perform special favors for John Jr. and Caroline or wait on them as servants, a confidential Secret Service memo declassified in the 1990s said. Quote, "Agents are not to carry clothes, beach articles, sand buckets, baby carriages, strollers, handbags, suitcases, etc. for Caroline and John Jr., and the children must carry their own clothing items, toys, etc." Secret Service agents did tag along when Jackie escorted John to his first day of school at St. David's at 12 East 89th Street. Once Jackie left, one agent remained on 89th Street on the left, one agent remained on 89th Street on the right, while another waited in a hallway outside the classroom. There was little the agents could do to safeguard John, but it soon became clear that JFK's son could stand up for himself, and then some. His first morning at St. David's, John got into a tiff with another boy who tauntingly called him John John. The other boy wound up with a bloody nose. There would be other fights with other students, which one faculty member chalked up to John's, quote, naturally high spirits. It also had something to do with the fact that for all his mother's efforts to keep him grounded, John was used to getting his way. He had a will of steel, the teacher said, no doubt about it. It wasn't that he was arrogant or bratty. He was just determined to exhaust the opposition until they finally gave in. It was equally true that nearly all of John's classmates seemed genuinely fond of him. John makes friends with everybody, Jackie said, immediately. It helped that his own cousin, William Kennedy Smith, also attended St. David's. The bond that John and Willie Smith formed would be one of the strongest and most important in John's life, lasting well into adulthood. In the spring of 1965, Jackie seized on another opportunity to spurn President LBJ. This time, the White House Rose Garden was being dedicated in her honor, and the president once again bombarded her with pleading phone calls. Jackie refused, but she did agree to send her mother in her place. Of course, President Johnson did not give up easily. For the next 4 years, Jackie received an official invitation to every state dinner and countless other White House affairs. She didn't even respond to a single one. Jackie and President Johnson had always gotten along quite well and were close in the days after the assassination, but once Bobby Kennedy, who hated Lyndon Johnson, really came into the picture following Jack's death, his influence over Mrs. Kennedy would drive a wedge between Jackie and the Johnsons. As the great Leonard Bernstein once observed at a party that Jackie attended with Bobby in the spring of '65, RFK, quote, hovered around Jackie like he owned her. On Memorial Day weekend, 1966, in Hyannisport, on what would have been Jack's 49th birthday, Jackie fulfilled a promise to John that the president had made shortly before his death. She gave John a reconditioned Piper Cub observation plane. Jack always said he was going to give John a real plane when he grew up, Jackie told JFK's friend Chuck Spaulding. Well, it's a little early, but now he has it, a real airplane. The World War II vintage aircraft had no propeller and no engine, but that did not prevent John from climbing into the cockpit and taking off from a thrilling make-believe aerial dogfight in the skies over Cape Cod. Jackie also understood that no matter how wonderful she was as a parent, there was little she could really do to protect either of her children from those who were mentally unhinged. "I'm nerve-wracked about the safety of these children," she told one of John's teachers. "There are so many nutcases about." Jackie and Caroline were leaving St. Thomas More Church on East 89th Street one Sunday when a woman ran up to Caroline and grabbed her by the arm. "Your mother is a wicked woman who has killed 3 people," she shrieked as Jackie stood there, horrified. "And your father is still alive." With the help of the Secret Service, Jackie succeeded in pulling the deranged woman off her, and she was taken to Bellevue Hospital for observation. "It was terrible prying her loose," Jackie recalled years later. "I still haven't gotten over that strange woman." Jackie always tried to walk her son home from school each day, and she was more determined than ever on November 22nd, 1966, the 3rd anniversary of her husband's assassination, not be any different. As they left the school, however, Jackie realized that several students were trailing them. They were less than halfway down the block when one of the children yelled, "Your father's dead! Your father's dead!" The others quickly joined in the chant. The cruel words were all too familiar to John's mother. "You know how children are," said Jackie. "They've even said it to me when I've run into them at school, as if, well, this day John listened to them saying it over and over, and he didn't say a word." What John did do was take his mother's hand and squeeze it firmly, without ever pausing to look back at their tormentors. Jackie later said that it was as if he was trying to reassure me that things were all right. And so we walked home together with those children following us. John was only 6 years old and already exhibiting a keen awareness of other people's feelings, especially his mother's. "He surprises me in so many ways," Jackie said. "He seems so much more than one would expect of a 6-year-old child. Sometimes it almost seems as if he is trying to protect me instead of just the other way around." That fall, John settled back into his school routine, taking his place among the other first graders at St. David's. Jackie was proud of both of her children's academic accomplishments. Caroline was more deserving, perhaps, but she fretted that they might become just two rich kids living on Fifth Avenue and going to nice schools. Uncle Bobby, for one, was not about to let that happen. He told them about the rats and other terrible living conditions that exist right here in the midst of a rich city, Jackie said. And when he described broken windows letting in the cold, John was so touched by that he said he'd go to work and use the money he made to put windows in those houses. Both Kennedy children were also shocked to learn that countless thousands of children their age never had or likely would receive Christmas presents. On the Christmas of 1967, John and Caroline gathered up most of their toys and asked Jackie to give them to the poor children in Harlem. Jackie and Roz Gilpatrick were exploring the ruins at Chichen Itza in Mexico when the news reached them in March of 1968 that Bobby was now running for president. Not long after, LBJ shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election for a second full term. As far as Jackie was concerned, with Johnson out of the way, Bobby had a clear path to the White House. "Do you know what will happen to Bobby?" she later asked Arthur Schlesinger. "The same thing that happened to Jack. There is so much hatred in this country, and more people hate Bobby than hated Jack. I've told Bobby this, but he isn't fatalistic like me." Bobby shrugged off Jackie's prophecies of doom. What troubled him now was the fact that she was seriously mulling over the idea of marrying Aristotle Onassis. The mere thought of JFK's sainted widow carrying on with a shadowy foreigner would inevitably leave a sour taste in the voters' mouths. But marriage? "For God's sake, Jackie," Bobby pleaded, "this could cost me 5 states." JFK's children were also an important part of the equation. Onassis knew that the world was in love with Caroline and John, and he figured no one would want to upset them by going after their stepfather, no matter who he was. John was especially important to Onassis because he embodied the future of the Kennedy dynasty. Ari couldn't resist the idea of shaping a future president, of having that kind of power and influence stretching into the next century. Bobby, meanwhile, was so appalled at the thought of Onassis becoming his brother-in-law that he dispatched Ethel and Teddy's wife, Joan, to New York to try to bring Jackie back to her senses. But it was only after Cardinal Cushing intervened that Jackie agreed to postpone her decision until after the election, ostensibly for Bobby's sake. Cardinal Cushing pointed out that, over and above Onassis's checkered past, the Vatican might not look kindly on President Kennedy's widow marrying a divorced man. Second grader John was sitting in his class at St. David's on April 4th, 1968, when an older student came into the room and whispered the news in his teacher's ear. Martin Luther King had been gunned down outside his Memphis motel room. JFK had introduced his children to the Nobel Peace Prize winner in the Oval Office, and Jackie once again found herself in the position of having to explain to John and Caroline why anyone would want to kill a great man like Dr. King. On June 4th, 1968, the day of the crucial winner-take-all California primary, Jackie made 2 afternoon campaign appearances for Bobby in New York. Then she had a late dinner with Gilpatrick at her apartment, and then waited for word from Los Angeles. When Bobby got to his 5th-floor suite at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he found flowers and a magnum of Dom Perignon waiting for him. "The flowers are for your room, and the champagne is for you after you win the primary. Jackie," the note read. Around 11 p.m. Eastern Time, George Plimpton, who had been with RFK on the campaign trail in California, called with the news. Bobby had won by a wide margin. That's wonderful, George, Jackie said. Tell Bobby I love him. Plimpton would later regret that, amid all the excitement, he never managed to convey Jackie's final message to Bobby. Jackie stayed up watching the returns on TV for another 4 hours and finally turned in around 3:15 a.m. A half hour later, the phone rang. Stas and Lee Radziwill were calling from London, where the BBC was reporting breaking news from the United States. "Jackie, how's Bobby?" Stas asked. "He's fine. He's terrific," Jackie replied. "You heard that he won California by 53%, didn't you?" "But, Jackie," Radziwill said, "he's been shot. It just happened a few minutes ago." They waited for what seemed like an eternity for Jackie to react. "No," Jackie cried. "It can't have happened. No, it can't have happened." John and Caroline, tucked in their beds at the other end of the sprawling apartment, somehow managed to sleep through their mother's screams. The most dire of Jackie's warnings had come true. After thanking supporters in the Ambassador Hotel ballroom, Bobby was leaving through the hotel's pantry when shots rang out. A young Palestinian named Sirhan, angered over the defeat of the Arabs in the recent Six-Day War with U.S.-supported ally Israel, had lunged from the shadows and fired 6 shots at Bobby. Within seconds, Jack's little brother was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, his eyes open, while Olympic decathlon champion Rayford Johnson and pro football legend Roosevelt Greer attempted to pry the pistol from Sirhan's hand. Ethel knelt next to her husband, whispering, "Oh my God, oh my God," while a busboy pressed a rosary in Bobby's hand and cradled his bleeding head. Jackie prepared to get on the first available flight to Los Angeles, but first she had to decide how to break the news to the children. Before leaving for the airport, Jackie woke them up gently and brought them into her room. "Something has happened to Uncle Bobby," she told them, "and I have to fly out to California to be with him." "What happened to Uncle Bobby?" Caroline asked as John wiped the sleep from his eyes. "A very bad man shot him," Jackie answered. "The doctors are doing everything they can for Uncle Bobby right now." Before she could even finish her sentence, Caroline burst into tears, and John quickly followed suit. Even at age 7, he could comprehend the enormity of what had just happened and experience the loss in a way he had been unable to following his own father's assassination in Dallas. John would spend the rest of his life wondering if he really remembered his father at all, but Uncle Bobby and this horrible day, those things would haunt him for the rest of his life. And if you're interested in the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy, I'm just going to put in a shameless plug for my podcast series that I devoted the better part of a year to producing. It's a 14-part so far podcast series called Who Killed Bobby Kennedy? And it's probably the most in-depth exploration of the RFK assassination that you'll find anywhere. And you can find a link to it down in the comments section or under the playlist tab of my channel. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode of JFK Jr., the man behind the myth. To really understand anyone, we have to understand their childhood. And in the case of John F. Kennedy Jr., this poor kid lived through so many tragedies in his young life in the public eye. He grew up in a fishbowl with the whole world watching. And yet his mother tried so hard to shield him from all of that scrutiny. And we all kind of, if you're of a certain age, we all feel like we grew up with John F. Kennedy Jr. And I was just one of many, I guess, who had the luck of having a personal friendship with John later on in adulthood. And if you're interested, you can check out that story, my personal story, in episode 2 of this series. So I'll be back next Saturday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, and we'll get into episode 4 of JFK Jr., the man behind the myth. Once again, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you back here next Saturday night. Until then, take care. I'm Lori Spencer.